Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from Travis Scott called The Birds in the Trap Sing McKnight. Man alive, Travis Scott can frustrate me. See, I didn't want to cover Rodeo back in 2015, mostly on the thinking that his production was too cavernous and dark to really support the banal party lyrics and his general lack of personality. But going back to that review now, I can say that I don't really hate that album so much as I found it kinda underwhelming. The problem wasn't as bad as on Days Before Rodeo, but Travis Scott was getting crowded off the stage by guest stars with more presence or charisma, and it was hard not to see that his persona was a composite of other artists. He didn't really have a distinct identity for himself. But that said, in recent months I've come to the conclusion that Travis Scott can work for me in the right environment, because he does have a knack for huge hooks that can go over the top, and he's not afraid to give his mix the depth that you really need to pull that off. I wouldn't really be expecting a lot of substance, but again, he's making over-the-top party music. You don't really need a lot of substance if you avoid errors and you crank up the bombast. That's one of the reasons I was a little bit exasperated when people accused me of not liking party music during the Ray Shrimmer reviews. I can like it when it's got convincing swell and personality that doesn't fill me with seething rage, and at least instrumentally, Travis Scott can mostly deliver that. And even over the past few months on hooks like Champions, he's been a propulsive presence on songs I've actually kind of liked. Now that said, I was a little bit worried about The Birds in the Trap Sing McKnight. Outside of the frankly bizarre title, this album had the feel of being rushed out to capitalize on Travis Scott's now ascending popularity, and yet it missed its planned release date twice because it was getting touched up, and with fewer production credits than ever. Yeah, I know he's the executive producer, but it's not a good sign that he's handling less of the beat work with every successive album when that production was what added so much flavor in the first place, and still a lot of guest stars. I had a lot of reason to be concerned with this, but I did really want to like this album. So, did Birds in the Trap Sing McKnight work for me? Well, honestly, while I know I enjoyed this more than Rodeo, yeah, I said it, I'm not sure I could tell you why. In terms of content or bars, Travis Scott really isn't delivering much that's incredibly distinctive or hard-hitting, or even all that different than what we got on Rodeo. Some people are calling it Rodeo B-sides, and even all that much that I would normally consider iconic about Travis Scott in his production, but yeah, I like this more. In other words, it's a decent album. Not a great album, or even a good one, and I'm still convinced that Travis Scott has a lot more he could do if he took full control of his production or made a more focused project, but it does show some improvements. I didn't mind this at all. Granted, I think more of the improvements come in what Travis Scott doesn't do in comparison with what he does. As a rapper, he doesn't tend to take a lot of chances, which means that his half-sung flows can mostly connect, but can start to blur together a little bit. I will say if we're looking at heavily auto-tuned rappers in this vein, I'll take Travis Scott over Future, because at least Travis Scott shows a greater breadth of emotion beyond droning nihilism, and he can actually enunciate. But the counterpoint to that is that, well, Travis Scott's not exactly strong as a technical lyricist. He forces rhymes or rhymes words with themselves, or in some cases like Biebs in the Trap, he opts for some painfully basic flows that don't really connect that well. And sure, he's not a complex or subtle lyricist, but for as strong as some of his hooks can be, it's a little bit frustrating that outside the Kid Cudi collaboration Through the Late Night or Wonderful with the Weeknd, or maybe Coordinate was a hook I actually kind of like, he doesn't really come through with some harder hitting, more bombastic choruses. I think some of this is because he opts for a slightly higher pitch compared to the thicker low to mid range in his voice where he sounds a little better, but again, that's my personal preference. Now, one area where Travis Scott has definitely improved considerably was his choice of guest stars, all of whom seem to know exactly what's expected from them on a Travis Scott project. And sure, it can sound a little weird for Kendrick Lamar of all people to drop some of his most basic bars on the love song Goosebumps, and that high-pitched voice he used, well, that certainly was something. But you can tell he's having fun in a way reminiscent of Untitled Unmastered from earlier this year. The song does have a strong reminiscence there. The rapper who takes things significantly more seriously is Andre 3000 on the ends, which opens up the album discussing how he could have easily been killed as a kid in the rash of child murders in Atlanta in the late 70s, early 80s. It accentuates that feel of slightly unstable, gritty danger that I've always liked about Travis Scott's production, even if it's rarely mirrored in the content, the fact that it all could be gone so quickly. Hell, even if 21 Savage's content is kinda gross on outside, he at least gets the atmosphere with his flow, and Cassie's crooning guest vocals on Lose match up the glitching bombast pretty well. Hell, even Young Thug's wonky flow kinda grew on me a bit on the pre-chorus at Pick Up the Phone, even if I'm still not wowed at all about the content. And while there is a part of me that thinks that Kid Cudi could have done more on his 2 collaborations on this album, especially on Way Back, he's fallen so far at this point, even rehashing his biggest hit is a welcome spark, and you can tell that Travis Scott is thrilled to work with him. One of the reasons that for me, Through the Late Night is easily the best song here, even despite that Cactus line, for which I'm actually kind of on the fence whether or not it's a stroke of genius or one of the worst things I've heard all year. And you know, I also kind of enjoy what The Weeknd did on Wonderful. He's always had good chemistry with Travis Scott, and the fact that the song plays as celebratory for the both of them is a fresh taste. Of course, they can't all be winners. Easily the worst track on this album is First Take. Travis Scott and Bryson Tiller pine over girls who are treating them badly, and then they try to reassert control, and it's as ugly as you would imagine. Not helped by Bryson Tiller still doing his Chris Brown impression. Dude, it's gotten old. Granted, this is where we have to talk about the lyrics and themes. I'm kind of at a loss here. As I said when I covered Rodeo, the actual content was the biggest weakness of that album, but most of that was driven by T.I. adding narration around the tracks to try to justify the empty hedonism, a stab at subtext that was never backed up by the bars. Interestingly, this album was going to try something similar with Andre 3000 before he just included a verse, but in an odd way, I kind of appreciate the lack of pretense. For the most part, this is an empty, drug-addled party album, and yet with The Weeknd, it seems like Travis Scott is constantly aware of those who are trying to live as hard as him around him and yet don't understand the deeper consequences or his own rationale. Tracks like Beebs in the Trap, Sweet Sweet, The Ends, and Outside don't just set the stage for Travis Scott's thinking, but also the slew of girls with cocaine around their noses desperate to capture more of that certain lifestyle. Which brings a certain irony, but by the time that this album switches to its final quarter with Lose and Guidance and Wonderful, Travis Scott is looking for more fun and enjoyment, not mire himself in depression. Which, come to think of it, has a similar emotional arc to parts of Beauty Behind the Madness by The Weeknd from last year. I can appreciate that. Hell, come to think of it, maybe that's why so much of the production on this album doesn't quite have the same punishing, cavernous darkness that used to be so iconic of Travis Scott. Because this is easily his most sparse album to date, especially in the bass lines and beats. The atmosphere is considerably thinner and pushes the vocals more to the forefront, even on darker songs with the gurgling, distant guitars and oily ghosts of synthesizer on the ends, or the sharper, low synths against the off-kilter, blurry melodies of Coordinate, or the trap pattern against the faded elegance of Through the Late Night. Again, that's a song I really like. The odd thing is that by lightening the atmosphere, a lot of the little intricacies in the production start to come out that I actually like a fair bit, especially when Travis Scott wants things to hit a little bit harder. The clattering beat that runs through SDP Interlude, the orchestral bombast of Lose, the faded woodwind whistle that flits around Sweet Sweet that slowly builds more depth with fluttering fragments, before heavily distorted guitars roar to life for a pretty sweet outro, a more magnified version of that layered outro on Way Back that shows Travis Scott is just as capable of cannibalizing Kanye West as the other way around. But that usage of distorted guitar, even if just accents, does some real heavy lifting here, operates as a counterbalance to the piano chords on Outside, or the off-kilter grid on Goosebumps, to the point where you wish they'd use it to augment the low synth swell and the shifts in percussion across Wonderful. He really could have taken the song over the top in a good way and driven this album really home, instead of a half-assembled, auto-tuned outro that, yeah, was fine, but it could have been better. But overall, look, I didn't mind this. I'm not gonna call it great. Again, I'm convinced that Travis Scott has a heavier, more anthemic project that would be a better fit for his persona and could deliver some more convincing impact, but this album does seem to show him on the path towards it. Coupled with stronger guest performances overall compared with Rodeo, yeah, I'm feeling a light 6 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you're a Travis Scott fan, you're looking for some solid club-ready tracks that might not have the same immediate impact as Rodeo, but does have some staying power all the same. As for everybody else, well, take it from a guy who's not a Travis Scott fan, this album didn't win me over, but it's on the right track. That's a good sign. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I will try to give them a listen. My schedule's really piling up right now. Also, got the poll up here. What'd you guys think of this album? You think it came together much harder? Do you think it's even better than Rodeo? Or, as so many of you has mentioned, that it fell kind of short? I don't think it did, but I've seen Anthony's review. I kind of understand where he's coming from. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.